right, guys. Today, we're going to be looking at the impact and power that color and contrast with color and light have on visual storytelling. So, to begin the lecture, I want you to look at the next couple of words on the slide and think of what comes to mind color-wise when you think of these words. First of all, let's start with fear. When you think of fear, what color usually comes to mind? Usually when I teach this class, we have people say black or, dark blue, gray, very ominous colors. Sometimes it's even red. Um, it can be various things, but there's always the darkness, right? Dark. Happiness. A lot of times when we think of happiness, students will say yellow or pink or orange, very bright, happy colors. Oppression. The most common color that people usually associate with oppression is red, sometimes black, gray, so very harsh colors. Courage. Usually with courage, I get blue, purple, which makes sense with Purple Heart, sometimes yellow or orange. Very bold colors. Rigidity. This is usually a dark kind of color. It's unmoving, harsh. So when you think about color, a lot of things come to mind, and color can mean a lot of different things. Not one color is associated with happiness or oppression or fear. They can mean different things in different circumstances, but what we have to understand is that color is a very psychological thing. It has a visceral reaction. When we look at it, we react in a very automatic way, and it's more visceral than it is intellectual. Yes, we can think, oh, purple is bravery or royal or whatever, but in contrast, we get that intellectual connection because of the way we feel. However, when you're watching something, you as an audience don't always put two and two together. And we as content creators have to, because we want that visceral reaction and we want them to feel a certain way about characters or scenes or what's happening, in a picture. So color is very, very powerful. And the lack of color is very, very powerful. Color really defines how we quote unquote feel. Um, and it's made up of light, right? Light reflects and retracts and refracts according to how it hits different surfaces, and that's how we get color. Color has a very profound effect on our emotional state, and sometimes it can really change how you feel about a person, a place, or a scene. I want you to watch this video and really notice how color plays a major impact on you as an audience when you watch movies.
This is the entire Star Wars trilogy. And this is the Lord of the Rings. Okay, before I can explain myself, let's talk about color really quick. Specifically, color in storytelling. Like music or visual composition, color palettes subconsciously portray emotion. A good story, from my experience, is simply a compelling collage of emotions. When it comes to movies and games, we're given the privilege of activating almost all of our senses in an effort to entertain, inspire, or provoke. But how do films and games do it? How do the creators know the right colors for the right environments? Or how do they decide what colors a scene should be? Like most everything in life, you have to plan ahead. Not knowing what the future has in store, you have to imagine it and block it out. Usually before you go to the store, you'll write down a grocery list. Before you start painting, you need a sketch. The same goes for creating color composition. In the immediate sense, that would be a single image and the color scheme for that scene. But how do you decide what each scene's colors should be so that when they are comprised together, it tells a story? You need a way to see the entire story from a bird's eye view and visualize the story progression. That's where color keys come in. In films and games, a lot of times the art director will have color keys made in order for the whole team to reference and understand the end goal. Each shot, or at least each sequence, will be very quickly painted in small color thumbnails. In pre-production, this makes for an easy, dynamic way to block out and brainstorm the general colors of the entire story. In the end, when you play that game or you watch that movie, you might not even notice that they went to the trouble. But if done right, you'll definitely feel it. Other than a few examples of storyboards that studios like Disney or Pixar have shared, how do we see stories and their color progression? Well, let's go back to the beginning of this video. These are movie barcodes. A movie barcode essentially compresses an entire movie into a single image. What you see here is every frame from the movie scaled down to 1 pixel wide and lined up in a row to create this barcode-like image. Here's a question. How well can you recognize movies based off of their color palette? Let's play a little game and find out. Below are 3 movie barcodes. One is Aladdin, one is Finding Nemo, and one is The Lion King. Which one's which? You've got 3 seconds. Okay, how about these? Star Wars: A New Hope, Blade Runner, and Mad Max. Which one's which? So as you can see, without even watching the movie, you can imagine the hot deserts in Mad Max, contrasting the few cool night scenes, giving you just enough of a break to plunge right back into the action. Or the deep reds at the end of The Lion King, emphasizing the intense climax. Colors for storytelling are all about relativity. They can't stand alone. What happens before it? What happens after it? How do they contrast each other? A color only means something when it has a relationship with another. The funny thing about color is, it's a lot different than you would usually think. When we were kids, we used to color water blue and the sun yellow, but that's only because it's the closest thing to blue in the picture, and the sun is the closest thing to yellow. We picture colors in our mind based off of the colors around them. In James Gurney's book, Color and Light, he explains how sometimes the colors we see are not always the colors that are used. Because colors are so dynamic and somehow create this fluent visual language, they can assist in the mood and emotion of a story. When I watched The Lord of the Rings for the first time, I was pretty young. I watched all 3 of them back to back. It was probably one of the best experiences for me when I think about storytelling with color. You start out in this very saturated, warm green environment, and as the story progresses, you don't even notice it right away. But when you get toward the end of the series, you realize how much darker and colder everything feels. Once the ring is finally gotten rid of, the movie ends in a very warm, comforting palette. The same thing happened when I played BioShock Infinite. You make it to the main game area and are greeted with warm, welcoming colors. But the colors change as you progress until the final boss, where you understand the intensity of the situation simply by its dramatic color palette. Vertigo is an example a lot of people like to use because it employs very blatant colors to get the story across. As you watch the film, you realize colors represent certain characters, while other colors emphasize John Ferguson's mood. So I guess all of this is to say that I'm doing my best to follow these very principles in our game. Since we're moving into the polish phase of development, I'm really trying hard to perfect the colors of our game. And because we're trying to tell a story without any words, audio and visual feedback is extra important. I hope that when it's finished, the colors in our game will excite and compel someone the same way it did for me when watching The Lord of the Rings.
So, It's a quick video. It explains things in a very easy, understandable way, but color is important, especially when you look at the barcodes of a film. That really highlights, like, oh my gosh, like the dramatic change in colors is very significant to the mood and the feel of how the movie progresses. So let's break down some colors. Red, of course, is a very vibrant color. It's a very advanced color. And sometimes it can mean lots of different things. So, what you have to know when you're thinking about red, whether in design, in movies, art, it's usually very spatially limiting, meaning that it creates a smaller space because it's very overwhelming. Sometimes it can be visually aggressive. And it usually means power, speed, fast. It can represent anger, and sometimes it can be very sensual. So for the examples, I have the red contrast of the dress, the red Chinese lanterns, a red flare, and then of course red tulips for tech because it's one of the things we're well known for in the spring. But you can see that red represents something very different in each of these pictures, but it's always very bold. Then you have yellow. Um, Yellow is also a very aggressive color, although you may not associate yellow with aggression. It's because it can be very hard on the eyes. It's very bold, it's very bright. And even though it can, make you feel happy or energetic, it can be visually confusing because it is so bright and overwhelming. But it usually is it's very cheery. It can also represent obsession because it can overtake what you're thinking. And it can be anxiety inducing if it's done too much. And sometimes it depends on the, you know, tone of the yellow, or, the brightness of it. Because, this yellow wall with the Vespa, it's pretty subtle. But then you have these kids playing baseball, and I'm pretty sure this is like Friendship Yellow, which is one of the local high schools, very bright. But then you have this field of flowers, and it's, very subtle compared to the sky, and it's soothing almost. So it can mean lots of different things. Then you have green, and green is one of my favorite colors. Um, and it can be both positive and negative. All of these photos, of course, are very positive, but sometimes it can represent, things like envy or poison. But usually it's used to represent life and growth and unity, such as like the gardener or the Shire at Hobbiton in New Zealand. We talked about that in the video. This stream or this, local little grocery store. Green can also represent evil in some entities. A lot of villains are usually painted in green. Then you have orange. Orange is usually associated with a very positive outlook. It can be somewhat overwhelming, not as overwhelming as yellow or red. Um, but when you combine those two, you get a very warm and welcoming color. It's very earthy. It can be exotic depending on the tone of it. But as you can see, it's very earth-like. You get that orange, dirt color, and it makes you think of fall. It's just very, you know, comforting to think, okay, orange is okay, but it can be overwhelming if you use too much. Then we have blue. Blue is a very finicky color, because there's so much variation to it. But it can be positive and negative as well, like green. They're very similar on the color wheel. Um, Bellatoni in 2005 said it's a color to think to, not to act to. It can be very soothing. A lot of people say that, you should have blue in your bedroom because it can calm you down. But it also represents powerlessness. A lot of times it represents loyalty because it can be a strong connector, stability, and intellect. Purple is next, and purple is my absolute favorite color. And it is usually associated with other. So either that's like a non-physical matter, like spirits. It can mean like oddness or weird, but it can also mean magical, mysticism, death. Um, Purple is a very versatile color. It's not extremely common um, when people think about it in like editorial situations. So it's not used a lot in movies or film or design because it can be kind of fickle and people can associate it with the other. Villains are often seen in purple as well. But as you can see, like Taylor Swift uses purple a lot, especially like in her Fearless era. There's some in the Lover era. Um, but concerts, that glowing hue, and then it represents kind of like stormy and starry nights. These are just a few colors, right? We have a spectrum of colors, but you can see that specific colors can make you feel certain things, but that doesn't mean that one specific color means one feeling, emotion, meaning. Um, they're kind of like adjectives, right? You can use them to represent different things, just as different adjectives can describe color. I think a lot of it has to do with how you're using it and in how much quantity. So we've talked about like the emotional appeal of color. So let's break it down a little more into the practical science. So when you have light and it is refracted and reflected and it goes through different prisms, you get what is visible light, right? We can see it. And that's why we can see different colors. But there are other temperatures or rays of light that we don't necessarily see. But when we think of color, we think of visible light. And it's in between ultraviolet and infrared right here. So similar to sound, light travels in waves, and the wavelength can kind of determine what you're seeing. And so we can see visible light because of the type of wavelength it is and the temperature it is. This is all theory, of course. I mean, there's science behind it, but we also have what's called color theory and how colors play with each other and how they make us feel. The thing with color theory is that it's just that it's a theory. And although they make sense of like contrasting colors or complementary colors, you can go beyond that and put things together or against each other in different ways. This just helps you get started. There are a few different types of color theories that go with this. And the first one is analogous colors. And that just means that there are colors that are similar to each other or close to each other on the wheel. So yellow and orange, right? Um, they're similar, but they can be different, especially the hues of them. Then you have complementary colors, and these are colors that usually contrast greatly from each other, meaning that they're on opposite sides of the wheel. So yellow and blue, green and purple, light blue and orange, or a brighter green and pink. So these usually mean that they will work well together, and the darker and the lighter hues go together as well. Then you have triadic colors, and these are colors that are equally distant from each other on the wheel. So you have yellow, blue, and purple are kind of all the same distance. They can work together or work against each other. It just depends on how you're putting them together. Then you have what's called tetradic colors, and this is a combination of two complementary color pairs. So you can see very similar to contrasting colors, but they're more of a combination of them. When we think about the color wheel and the color science and theory, we get what's also known as dominant versus recessive colors. And so some colors are very dominant, like red, orange, yellow, and they kind of attack the eye. Versus recessive colors like blues, purples, and greens, they tend to recede from the eye. And this is where you get that visceral reaction, right? Because if something attacks you, you're going to react to it differently than something that may kind of back out and recede from you and make you feel more calm. So when you look at color theory, so you have the blue bonnets, they, kind of fade into the background a little bit, but you get that orangey pink color of these flowers. It really stands out, especially against that blue. Another way to think about it is when you have a professor who doesn't know color theory and they make a PowerPoint like this, and they make a very bright, demanding color as the background, and then put a very light color like white on top of it. And you can't see it because yellow is just attacking your eyes. But you also don't want to put dark and dark together, right? Because then it's still hard to read. Easier because your eyes are receding a little bit, but still not the best combination. This is where we get contrast. Contrast is very important because it allows you to put these complementary colors together in ways that are pleasing. So black and white. So contrast is kind of the opposite of color. So whereas color is an interpretive feature of a visual, contrast is rather an instrument. It's really a way to distinguish content in a frame through tonal separation. So where color, is on the color wheel or the spectrum, tonal separation is, black and white, and then where those tones go between that. Tones that are contrasting really reflect greater visual intensity, black and white, and tones that have greater affinity, so they're closer together, exhibit less visual intensity. So this doesn't have a lot of intensity, this does. When you think about contrast, there's a few different types. One is high key contrast, meaning that the majority of the value or the tones in the visual are bright. They have a high affinity. So like this picture, it's, it has contrast with the darker parts of her hair and her features, but for the majority of it, it's white. Then you have low key contrast, majority of lower light tones and a very high affinity as well. It's just meaning it's pleasing, right? It's okay, but this one has more shadow than it does light. Then you have full contrast. So this is where tones of equal parts, light, dark, and bright are together. And there's very little contrast. The contrast comes from the colors, right? So you get the color of the yellow and the blue and some reds, but visually it's all very similar to dark shadows, bright brights, and middle gray. Then you can have high contrast, and this is when there is a majority of tones that are either bright or low and few tones between. This is very high contrast, right? So you get black and white, but then you get some in the middle, but it's not as visceral as the white and the black. And then you have low contrast. This is made up of a lot of middle tones or medium gray. This is what most digital cameras are attuned to pick up for white balance, is that middle gray. It has a high affinity. It's not, attacking to the eye, but you can see there's lots of blue, there's some greens, the pop of yellow helps, but it doesn't, like, there's not a big pop of color, right? So that's a little lecture on color, contrast, how they work together, and how color plays such a big part in visual storytelling. So If you have any questions, let me know and we will continue on next week.